May 5, 1945, 6:47 a.m. The summit of Mito Escarpment, Okinawa. The earth shook as Japanese artillery shells tore into the American position. Private First Class Desmond Doss crouched behind a shattered tree stump, his hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. Around him, the 307th Infantry Regiment's assault on Hacksaw Ridge was collapsing. Men screamed. Others lay silent in the volcanic dirt, their bodies torn by machine gun fire and mortar fragments. The air smelled of cordite blood and the sulphurous soil of Okinawa. Doss had no weapon, no rifle, no pistol, not even a knife. His only equipment was a medical kit, a Bible in his breast pocket, and a rope he'd perfected tying into a special knot during training. As Japanese forces launched their counterattack, American officers screamed the order to retreat. Soldiers scrambled toward the cliff's edge, desperate to reach the cargo nets that would carry them back down the 400-foot escarpment to safety. But Desmond Doss didn't move toward the nets. He moved deeper into the killing zone, toward the cries of "medic" that echoed across the plateau. What happened over the next 10 hours would earn him the Medal of Honor and cement his place as the most unlikely hero of World War II. A man who refused to carry a weapon would save more lives in a single day than most soldiers save in an entire war. A conscientious objector who had been mocked, beaten, and threatened with court-martial would prove that the greatest weapon any soldier possesses is not the rifle in his hands, but the courage in his heart. To understand how Desmond Doss reached that blood-soaked plateau on Okinawa, we must go back to a childhood in Lynchburg, Virginia, and a moment that would define the rest of his life. 1932. Lynchburg, Virginia. Desmond Thomas Doss was 13 years old when he nearly killed his brother. The two boys had been roughhousing in their bedroom, a typical sibling scuffle that turned serious when Desmond grabbed a brick and struck his brother Harold in the head. Harold collapsed, blood streaming from the wound. Desmond stood frozen, the brick still in his hand, staring at what he'd almost done. His mother Bertha rushed Harold to the hospital. The wound required stitches, but Harold survived. That night, Desmond's mother showed him a framed picture that hung in their home. It depicted the 10 Commandments, illustrated with scenes from biblical stories. She pointed to the 6th commandment, the one illustrated with Cain standing over Abel's murdered body. "Thou shalt not kill." "You almost broke this today," she told her son. "You almost took your brother's life." Desmond never forgot that moment. The Doss family were Seventh-day Adventists, devout Christians who observed Saturday as the Sabbath and took the commandments literally. For Desmond, "Thou shalt not kill" was not a suggestion or a moral guideline to be interpreted contextually. It was an absolute prohibition that applied in all circumstances, even war. His father Tom Doss had served in World War I and returned home traumatized by what he'd witnessed in the trenches of France. Tom rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, young Desmond heard stories of unimaginable violence, of men torn apart by artillery shells, of corpses stacked like cordwood. Tom Doss became an alcoholic, haunted by memories he couldn't escape. One night in a drunken rage, he pulled a gun on Desmond's uncle during a family argument. Bertha Doss threw herself between the two men, wresting the pistol from her husband's hands before anyone was killed. Desmond watched this scene unfold from the doorway. He saw his father, a war veteran, reduced to violence by alcohol and trauma. He saw the gun, the instrument designed solely to end human life, and he made a vow he would never touch a firearm. Never carry one, never use one, not even to save his own life. December 7, 1941, Newport News Naval Shipyard, Virginia. Desmond Doss was working as a ship joiner, helping build vessels for the U.S. Navy when news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached the shipyard. Men gathered around radios, listening in stunned silence as reports described the devastation in Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. War was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. Doss could have claimed a military deferment. His job at the shipyard was considered essential war work. He could have stayed home, safe, contributing to the war effort from behind the security of American shores. Many Seventh-day Adventists chose this path, and the church supported conscientious objectors who refused military service entirely. But Desmond Doss saw things differently. He believed the war against fascism was just. He believed America needed to be defended. He believed he had a duty to serve his country, not despite his religious beliefs, but because of them. He would not kill, but he could save lives. He would not carry a weapon, but he could carry wounded men to safety. In April 1942, Desmond enlisted in the United States Army. He requested classification as a conscientious objector and assignment to the Medical Corps. He assumed the Army would respect his religious convictions. He was wrong. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Basic training. Summer 1942. The harassment began almost immediately. Desmond was assigned to a rifle company in the 77th Infantry Division, not to the Medical Corps as he'd requested. His commanding officers assumed that peer pressure and military discipline would force him to compromise his beliefs. They were wrong. During rifle training, Desmond refused to touch a weapon. Sergeant Howell, his drill instructor, ordered him to pick up the M1 Garand rifle lying on the ground. Desmond politely declined. Howell exploded, screaming in Desmond's face, calling him a coward and a weakling. Other recruits watched the confrontation, some with pity, most with contempt. One soldier later recalled, "We thought he was faking to get out of combat. We thought he was using religion as an excuse because he was afraid to fight. We had no respect for him." The harassment escalated. When Desmond knelt beside his bunk to pray at night, soldiers threw boots at his head. They mocked him, calling him Holy Joe and worse. One recruit promised he would shoot Desmond in the back during their first combat engagement. No one wanted to be in his squad. No one trusted him, but Desmond never retaliated. He never complained. He simply continued doing his duty, working harder than anyone else, volunteering for the worst details, serving his fellow soldiers with quiet determination. When a recruit collapsed from heat exhaustion during a training march, Desmond gave him his own water canteen, even though Desmond was just as dehydrated. When other soldiers developed painful blisters, Desmond had a technique for treating them that brought immediate relief. Slowly, grudgingly, some soldiers began to see Desmond differently. He wasn't a coward. He was the strongest man in the company, not physically perhaps, but in ways that mattered more. The conflict with his officers proved more difficult. Captain Cunningham tried to force Desmond to carry a rifle by denying him weekend passes to visit his fiancée Dorothy unless he completed weapons training. When Desmond cited regulations protecting his conscientious objector status, Cunningham tried to humiliate him by forcing a rifle into his hands in front of the entire company. "Take this rifle or I'll court-martial you," Cunningham snarled. Desmond let the rifle fall to the ground. Another officer intervened before Cunningham could follow through on his threat, but the incident left Desmond isolated and vulnerable. His captain, Jack Glover, and Sergeant Howell attempted to have Desmond discharged under Section 8, claiming mental instability. The argument was simple. Only a mentally ill person would volunteer for combat but refuse to carry a weapon. But Army psychiatrists found Desmond completely sane. His religious convictions, however unusual, did not constitute mental illness. Frustrated, Glover and Howell made Desmond's life miserable through grueling labor assignments and constant harassment. One night, a group of soldiers beat Desmond while he slept. They stopped short of seriously injuring him, but the message was clear. He was not wanted. The next morning, officers asked Desmond to identify his attackers. He refused. Despite everything, Desmond would not betray his fellow soldiers. Desmond also insisted on observing the Sabbath from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Every week, he requested a pass to attend church services. Every week, his Jewish commanding officer denied the request in disbelief. Unable to understand why Desmond would risk court-martial for Saturday worship, when the Jewish officer himself didn't strictly observe Shabbat. What his officers didn't know was that Desmond volunteered to work on Sundays, taking shifts and assignments when other soldiers wanted time off. He wasn't trying to shirk responsibility. He was trying to honor his faith. Finally, when Desmond's unit was about to ship overseas, Captain Cunningham denied him leave to marry Dorothy. Desmond's father, Tom, despite his alcoholism and trauma, intervened. Tom contacted Carlisle B. Haynes, chairman of the church's War Service Commission in Washington. Haynes called Desmond's regimental commander, Colonel Stephen S. Hamilton, and asked if federal intervention was necessary to protect Desmond's constitutional rights. The colonel backed down. Desmond received a 3-day pass. He married Dorothy in August 1942, and a few weeks later, he shipped out to the Pacific Theater with the 77th Infantry Division. The Army had finally, grudgingly, assigned him to the medical detachment. He would be a combat medic, unarmed, unprotected, sent into battle with nothing but bandages and faith. Guam, July 1944. Desmond saw his first combat during the liberation of Guam. The 77th Infantry Division fought through dense jungle against Japanese forces who had fortified the island for months. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat where visibility extended only a few yards through thick vegetation. Desmond quickly proved his worth. When the cry "medic" rang out, Desmond ran toward it without hesitation, often before the shooting stopped. He treated wounded soldiers under fire, his hands steady as bullets cracked past his head. He dragged men to safety, patched sucking chest wounds, applied tourniquets to shattered limbs, whispered prayers over the dying. The soldiers who had mocked him in training now watched in awe. Captain Glover, who had tried to have Desmond discharged, personally recommended him for the Bronze Star Medal after Desmond saved several men from Glover's unit during a firefight. Sergeant Howell, who had called Desmond a coward, witnessed Desmond run directly into Japanese machine gun fire to reach a wounded soldier. Howell later said, "Doss was the bravest man I ever met." The soldier who had promised to shoot Desmond in the back apologized. "I was wrong about you," he said. "You're the guy I want next to me in combat." Desmond received his first Bronze Star for actions on Guam. A second Bronze Star followed for his service in the Philippines. But the defining moment of his life, the moment that would test every conviction he held, was still ahead. Okinawa, April 29, 1945. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa as part of the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. The island was the final stepping stone before an invasion of mainland Japan. Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had spent months transforming Okinawa into a fortress. They had dug miles of tunnels, fortified every cave and ridge, and prepared for a battle they knew they would lose but hoped to make so costly that America would hesitate to invade Japan itself. The key terrain was the Mita Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge. Whoever controlled that plateau controlled the southern approach to Shuri, the last major Japanese stronghold on Okinawa. Taking it would be a nightmare. A company of the 307th Infantry Regiment tried first. They climbed cargo nets to reach the summit and were almost immediately annihilated by Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. Of the company that reached the top, fewer than one-third made it back down alive. On May 2, 1945, B Company, which included Desmond Doss, climbed the cargo nets alongside the remnants of a company for a second assault. Before stepping off, the company gathered in a circle. Desmond led them in prayer. "Lord," he said quietly, "we don't know what we're about to face up there, but we ask you to protect these men, give them courage, bring them home safe." Amen. Men who had once mocked his faith now bowed their heads with him. They climbed the nets into hell. May 24, 1945, the summit of Hacksaw Ridge. For 3 days, American forces held the plateau against constant Japanese counterattacks. The fighting was medieval in its brutality. Grenades flew back and forth. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in narrow trenches. Japanese forces attacked from tunnels that emerged behind American lines, appearing like ghosts from the volcanic rock. Desmond worked without rest. He had removed all insignia marking him as a medic, after learning that Japanese snipers specifically targeted medics to demoralize American forces. He crawled through enemy fire, often so close to Japanese positions he could hear soldiers whispering in their tunnels. He treated wounds in shell craters while mortar rounds exploded around him. He carried men to the cliff's edge and lowered them down the cargo nets to medical stations below. On May 4, during an ambush where Japanese soldiers pretended to surrender before opening fire, Desmond saved Captain Glover's life by throwing himself on a grenade. The grenade failed to detonate. Desmond and Glover lived, but the worst was yet to come. May 5, 1945, dawn. The Japanese counterattack began before sunrise. Artillery shells rained down on American positions with devastating accuracy. Machine gun fire swept the plateau from multiple directions. Within minutes, the American defensive line began to crack. Soldiers fell by the dozens. The wounded screamed for medics, but there were too many casualties and too few medics. Captain Glover assessed the situation and made the only tactical decision that made sense: retreat. They would regroup, bring up reinforcements, and try again another day. "Fall back," Glover shouted. "Everyone to the nets, now!" Soldiers scrambled toward the cliff's edge, desperate to reach the cargo nets before Japanese forces overran the position. Within 10 minutes, most of B Company had climbed down to safety. But dozens of wounded men remained on the plateau, unable to walk, unable to climb the nets on their own. Army doctrine was clear. You don't leave wounded behind if you can help it, but you also don't sacrifice additional lives in hopeless situations. The wounded on Hacksaw Ridge were effectively lost. Desmond Doss didn't see it that way. While his company retreated, Desmond ran toward the wounded. He found Private Clarence Glenn with both legs shattered by machine gun fire. Glenn couldn't walk, couldn't crawl. He was going to die on that plateau unless someone helped him. Desmond dragged Glenn 75 yards to the cliff's edge under constant fire. He secured the special knot he'd perfected in training, a rappelling rig that would support a man's weight, and lowered Glenn over the edge. Medical personnel at the base of the cliff caught Glenn and pulled him to safety. Desmond looked back across the plateau. Dozens more wounded soldiers lay scattered across the volcanic dirt. He could hear them calling for help. Japanese forces were advancing, and Desmond was alone. He ran back into the killing zone. For the next 10 hours, Desmond Doss performed a miracle. One by one, he located wounded soldiers, dragged or carried them to the cliff's edge, and lowered them to safety using the rope. Some were conscious and could help. Most were not. Desmond moved through machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and mortar strikes. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, hunting for survivors. Witnesses below the cliff watched in disbelief as wounded men kept appearing at the top, lowered by unseen hands. Soldiers who had been presumed dead arrived at the medical station with fresh bandages and stories of an unarmed medic working alone on the plateau. With each rescue, Desmond prayed the same prayer: "Lord, please help me get one more, just one more." He rescued Private James WWII, who had been shot through the chest and left for dead. He rescued Private Harold Doss, no relation, whose arm had been nearly severed by shrapnel. He rescued Sergeant Thomas Howell, the same sergeant who had tormented Desmond in basic training. Howell was unconscious, bleeding from multiple wounds. Desmond carried him over his shoulder through a gauntlet of Japanese fire. Japanese snipers took shots at Desmond. Machine gunners tracked his movement. Yet somehow, impossibly, Desmond was not hit. He attributed it to divine protection. Others simply called it a miracle. By late afternoon, Desmond had lowered 75 men to safety. 75 soldiers who should have died lived because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. When the last man had been lowered, Desmond collapsed from exhaustion at the base of the cliff. His uniform was soaked with other men's blood. His hands were torn and bleeding from handling the rough rope, but he was smiling. "I kept my promise," he whispered to Captain Glover, who stood nearby in shock. "I stayed by your side saving life while you took it." May 21, 1945. Night. Desmond's ordeal wasn't over. 16 days after his heroic stand on May 5, American forces were still fighting for control of Okinawa. During a night assault near Shuri, Desmond was treating wounded soldiers in a shell crater when a Japanese grenade landed at his feet. He tried to kick it away. The grenade exploded, driving 17 pieces of shrapnel into his legs and lower body. The pain was excruciating. Blood poured from the wounds, but Desmond didn't call for another medic. He knew the other medics were pinned down under fire. Calling for help would mean another man risking his life, so Desmond treated himself. He applied tourniquets to his own legs, packed the worst wounds with bandages from his medical kit, and waited. For 5 hours, he lay in that crater while the battle raged around him. Finally, litter bearers reached him and began carrying him to safety. But during the evacuation, they came under Japanese tank attack. Machine gun fire swept the area. One of the bearers was hit and fell. Desmond saw another soldier lying nearby, more critically wounded than himself. Without hesitation, Desmond rolled off the stretcher and told the bearers to take the other man first. He would wait. The bearers protested. Desmond was seriously wounded and losing blood. But Desmond insisted. They took the other soldier. While waiting for the bearers to return, Desmond was hit again, this time by a sniper's bullet that shattered his left arm, leaving it with a compound fracture. The pain was unbearable. His arm dangled at an unnatural angle, bones protruding through torn flesh. Desmond found a discarded rifle stock lying nearby. With his good hand, he bound the rifle stock to his shattered arm as a makeshift splint. Then he began crawling. For 300 yards, Desmond dragged himself across rough terrain under constant fire, his broken arm secured with a rifle stock, his legs bleeding from shrapnel wounds. When he finally reached the aid station, the medics couldn't believe he was alive. They evacuated him to the hospital ship USS Mercy. Desmond had served 29 days on Okinawa. In that time, he had saved well over 100 lives. He had been wounded multiple times, and he had never once fired a shot in anger. October 12, 1945. The White House lawn, Washington, D.C. President Harry S. Truman stood on the lawn with a blue ribbon in his hands. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, hung from that ribbon. Before him stood Corporal Desmond T. Doss, still recovering from his wounds, his left arm in a sling. Truman read the citation aloud. It detailed Desmond's actions on Hacksaw Ridge, the 75 men saved on May 5, the countless others rescued during subsequent days. It described his selflessness on May 21, when he gave up his stretcher and crawled 300 yards with a broken arm and shrapnel-torn legs. When Truman finished reading, he placed the medal around Desmond's neck and shook his hand warmly. "I'm proud of you," Truman said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond was the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. To this day, he remains one of only 3 conscientious objectors ever to receive the award, and the only one who refused to carry a weapon under any circumstances. After the war, Desmond Doss returned to Lynchburg, Virginia. He never fully recovered from his injuries. Tuberculosis, contracted during his time in military hospitals, cost him a lung and 5 ribs. He lived with chronic pain from his wounds for the rest of his life. He could never return to his pre-war work as a carpenter and ship joiner, but Desmond never expressed regret. He married Dorothy, his wartime sweetheart, and they raised a son together. He became active in his Seventh-day Adventist church and spent decades speaking to young people about faith, courage, and service. When asked about his experience on Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond was characteristically humble. "I was just doing my job," he would say. "I was doing what the Lord called me to do," but the men he saved saw it differently. They saw a man who embodied the highest ideals of military service, without ever accepting its most fundamental requirement. They saw someone who proved that courage has nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with character. Captain Jack Glover, who had tried to have Desmond court-martialed and discharged, later said, "He was the bravest man I ever knew. He had convictions and he lived by them." In combat, when everyone else had a weapon, Doss had only his faith, and somehow that was enough. The legacy Desmond Doss passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. His story has been told in books, documentaries, and most famously in the 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson and starring Andrew Garfield. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations and won 2, introducing Desmond's story to a new generation. But the true legacy of Desmond Doss extends beyond Hollywood recognition. It lies in the fundamental question his life poses: what defines a hero? In every war, heroism is typically measured in enemies killed, objectives captured, battles won. The greatest warriors are those who inflict the most damage on the enemy while protecting their comrades. Medals are awarded for valor in combat, for charging machine gun nests, for single-handedly destroying enemy positions. Desmond Doss received the Medal of Honor for none of those things. He never killed an enemy soldier. He never destroyed a Japanese position. He never fired a shot. His heroism was measured entirely in lives saved, in wounded men carried to safety, in the refusal to leave anyone behind. He proved that the greatest strength is not the ability to take life, but the courage to preserve it, even at the cost of your own. He demonstrated that convictions matter, that faith can sustain you through unimaginable trials, that one person living according to their deepest beliefs can change the world. The soldiers on Hacksaw Ridge learned something that May morning in 1945. They learned that the man they had mocked as a coward possessed a courage that surpassed their own. They learned that the man who refused to carry a weapon was more dangerous to the enemy than 100 armed soldiers, because he refused to let the enemy win. Every wounded soldier Desmond saved was a soldier who could return to fight another day. Every life preserved was a victory over the forces trying to destroy them. Desmond Doss proved that you don't need a weapon to be a warrior. You need conviction. You need compassion. You need the courage to stand alone when everyone else tells you you're wrong. You need the faith to run toward danger when every instinct screams to run away. On May 5, 1945, while 75,000 American soldiers fought for control of Okinawa, one unarmed medic fought for something more important. He fought for the principle that every life has value, that no one should be left behind, that faith and courage matter more than firepower. 75 men went home to their families because Desmond Doss believed in that principle strongly enough to risk everything for it. 75 men who should have died on a blood-soaked plateau in Okinawa lived full lives, raised children, grew old, and told their grandchildren about the man who wouldn't kill, but saved them anyway. That is the legacy of Desmond Doss, not the medals, not the recognition, not the Hollywood film. The legacy is in the lives he saved and the example he set. The legacy is the proof that one person, armed with nothing but conviction and compassion, can accomplish miracles. The cargo nets still hang on Hacksaw Ridge, or at least the memory of them does. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the voice of a young medic from Virginia praying as he worked, "Lord, please help me get one more, just one more life saved. One more soul carried to safety. One more person who mattered enough to risk everything for." In the end, that's what heroism looks like. Not the warrior with the most weapons, but the man with the most courage. Not the soldier who takes the most lives, but the one who saves them. Desmond Doss understood something that took the rest of the world a war to learn. The greatest victory is not defeating your enemy. It's refusing to become like them. It's holding onto your humanity when everything around you descends into inhumanity. It's saving life when the world is consumed with taking it. That lesson, purchased with blood and courage on a volcanic plateau in Okinawa, remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. The weapons change. The wars change. But the need for people like Desmond Doss, people willing to stand for their convictions even when the whole world opposes them, never changes. He was a man who wouldn't kill. And in refusing to kill, he became immortal.